We don't think of Columbus, Ohio as a cattle town, but it was. This part of the world was producing enormous amounts of cattle in the years before the American Civil War. Part of that was because you could cheaply produce large numbers of cattle in this part of the world, and with the advent of the national road and improvements in transportation, it wasn't all that difficult to raise cattle in Ohio and drive them east. The national road had begun in 1811 in Frederick, Maryland, and sort of marched its way slowly across America heading west. By 1831, it had arrived in Columbus with a roadbed 60 foot wide, 5 feet deep of gravel with stone bridges along the way. Arriving in Columbus, the national road came into town on the main street. The idea originally was it would leave town on Main Street. Local merchants objected that the whole downtown would be missed if they did that, so the national road came into Columbus on Main Street, hung a right on High Street, went to Broad Street, hung a left, and headed out of town to one of the smallest bridges you've ever seen that had been built earlier in Columbus's history. Columbus needed a new bridge, so local folks got together and raised some money and basically worked with the federal government coming to Columbus to build a massive new bridge across the Scioto River to handle the national road. 3 Army officers from West Point came from Columbus to supervise the construction between 1832 to 1834. They built a gigantic block-long covered bridge that is actually 2 covered bridges side by side with a massive roof over the top and pedestrian covered walkways on each side. It can handle 4 lanes of traffic, 2 in each of the internal covered bridges. The question was, how do we test the bridge? Just as they were trying to decide how to test the bridge, coming into town from the west was Dick Cowling out of London, Ohio, with 700 head of cattle. He originally came up toward the bridge, took one look and said, that bridge is not going to hold the cattle. I'm going to take my cattle downstream to the ford near Main Street and cross my cattle down there. Captain Brewerton, who had supervised the building of the bridge, came up to Cowling and he said, look, I think the cattle can handle the bridge and we will reimburse you if anything happens as a result of your cattle crossing the bridge. Cowling said, okay, fine. And the next morning they began to push, because the cattle weren't exactly excited about going into a dark covered bridge. The cattle began to be pushed into the bridge, and then one thing led to another, and one cow pushed another, and soon we had a stampede crossing the bridge of 700 cattle, and this enormous cloud of dust coming up from the bridge as the cattle thundered across the bridge, and the entire bridge sank about 4 inches. This enormous crowd that had turned up thought that the whole bridge was going to collapse, but it didn't. And all 700 cattle end up moving down Broad Street. And coming out of the dust of the bridge is Dick Cowling walking behind his cattle. He comes up to Captain Brewerton and says, good bridge, by God. And then he invites all of his friends and acquaintances to join him at Zollinger's Tavern to celebrate the fact that they made it across the bridge.